Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 19. The Seleucid Empire extends from the eastern shores of the Inner Sea to the western border of Indiki, this latter place being the civilized but ignorant land which rests in the corner of the world. This vast territory is a beast of grand contrasts. On the one hand, you will find the richest nooks of civilization that you could imagine, with supreme soil and wondrous conditions for enjoying a long life. On the other hand, you will find long stretches of arid, dusty land that is too hot to be of use to man and is not popular with most animals either. It is from the former that huge and powerful empires operate, such as the Persians or Parthians of old. It is from the latter that the fragility of these empires and their tendency to fall suddenly originates. Thus, the Seleucids, a band of monarchs with a shallow legacy, sat upon an immense tower that swayed to and fro in a wind that blew from both west and east, and the bricks of their redoubt began to tremble. I have detailed already how Tyre was lost to the Bosporans, or what remained of it. Against the might of the Seleucids, the 200 soldiers Dion left to police his slaves were unlikely to prevent the conquest being overturned, and yet not even a single rider came from the north or east to witness this state of affairs. This is because the Seleucids were unprepared for a war in the west, having delegated responsibility for this frontier to their client kings from Armenia, who in turn were afraid of the Bosporans and wished to be separate from the muddy war that was unfolding. Further to this, there were matters in the east that commanded Seleucid attention, and it is time I laid them out so that the war can be understood to its full breadth. At the outset of the war, word eventually found its way to Sarai at the northern end of the Hyrcanian Ocean. Since the Seleucids controlled the southern end of this body and serviced the majority of the ships used in merchant business, the matter was of vital economic importance. Any disruption to the network of traders Spartacus had carefully raised might return the region to the chaotic state of a civilizational frontier, if you will grant it had moved beyond that state, and not all do. That is why the people of Sarai took up arms and fielded an army of several thousand spearmen. They served under a strategos named Aeneas, a student of Spartacus from those heady days of the city's birth. He marched away to traverse the eastern descent along the Hyrcanian Ocean, and sent messengers to seek out orders on what sort of approach he should take when he encountered the enemy. These messengers returned with only the authority of the Chariskos Council, since the king and his court were out of reach. The message was that Aeneas was to ensure that all sacrifices had been properly made, after which he would spread order to all of the Hyrcanian Ocean's shores. This directive could be interpreted in almost any way Aeneas pleased, and so his character was tested here via the style of his response, and it could even be that this was the intention of Chariskos in their lax approach. Aeneas' character was one of eagerness, to the extent that he was improper at times, because he was completely unafraid of death, being more so afraid of living without exposing himself to danger. I would judge him to be an effective but undesirable leader, whose abilities were sharp enough to empower himself beyond what his righteousness could cover. Alas, with the Golden Age not yet returned, men of superior faculty and authority were not at hand, or were but children then. So Aeneas took up his spear, chosen by the late king, and not by the tripartite. He marched without incident down the full length of the ocean, supplied by the Bactrians, who also hated the Seleucids and warred with them constantly, despite having a shared lineage only recently diverged from in historical terms. Not that this matters much. Think of how brothers from the same parents will war even more remorselessly than complete strangers. There was a Seleucid-controlled city near the southern coast called Hekatompilos that had its hands in all business that travelled to Sarai, and held the Bactrians hostage through tariffs that left them only the choices of poverty or death. Naturally, they were used to the Bactrians coming under arms to try and overturn this, and never did the city fail to defeat their foes and harshen the terms of trade in punishment. This is what they mistook Aeneas to be doing when his army arrived, which was in the spring of 171 prior, before the fall of Tyre I covered previously had taken place. The city's men arrayed themselves on the road and waited for 2 days for Aeneas to approach. Aeneas detected this well in advance, and was as eager to reach the battlefield as a thirsty man is to reach a stream, not seeking any course other than directly into the front of the enemy. We don't have records of the Seleucid view of the matter here, but I believe that they did not realize they were in fact facing an army from Sarai that day, because even when the armies were within shouting distance, the conditions in the arid hills were dusty and harsh, as if a fire somewhere was suffocating the land in smoke, to the point that the armies could not entirely see their own formations, let alone the details of the enemy's standards. This arrangement favoured the Seleucids, for they fought as their founders did, in the closely packed pike phalanx that all newcomers to warfare cannot fathom a remedy to. Alas, the people of Sarai were veterans and children of veterans, and they had for company hundreds of riders from the Anthropophagi lithosis, whose hunting instinct viewed the armoured phalanx like a lumbering beast of the plains to be tormented into death and prizes. Therefore, the soldiers inspirited Aeneas with confidence as much as he did to they, and this was as ideal a way to conduct a march to battle as there can be. There was no meeting of leaders to discuss terms, or halt for a conference of strategy among officers. Aeneas had briefed his men in small groups as they marched, like a teacher shepherding children, and the Seleucids likely didn't expect anything of note to emerge from the storming dust, so took to the battle as standard drill. We know that the Seleucids had two lines of battle, neither visible to each other. The first was a light detachment of spearmen and young javelin throwers, and they charged when they realized that the Bosporans had marched right up to them through the dust. The Bosporans were arranged in the fashion designed by Spartacus, with white-shielded citizen soldiers in a 5-rank line, and archers speeding forwards and back to strike where openings were given. The Seleucid force was thinner and improperly manned to face this line, although when they threw their javelins, it was with force and range that the Bosporans had not seen before, and the injuries sustained from it were dire. Still, the Seleucids suffered more in the clash of shields and spears, and withdrew after many lives were lost and many arms were robbed from panicked companies. The Bosporans surged after them into the dust, and Aeneas reeled them back with Spartacid discipline, knowing the day incomplete. Indeed, the true force that faced them came out of the dust to which the first men had fled, looking not afeared but fearsome. The Sarissa pike lined their being to the front and above, and they chanted as they moved to keep their steps to an inevitable rhythm. This was the line of battle that had conquered the world, and the tips of the pikes came to knock on the Bosporan shields. The Bosporans were instructed to back away, but found they were not always able to, as the intensity of the assault kept the danger close. Missiles were set upon the phalanx to sometimes cause harm, if the rich armour they wore failed them. Aeneas did not have the ability to control what would happen in the battle from here on, as he was reliant upon his lithosis wing to come and change the course of things, and they were invisible amidst the sand, wind, and horrid chorus of fighting. The reason they were not there when the worst of the fighting took place was because they had found that bands of Seleucid camp followers were loitering near the battle to process its spoils. Slaughtering these hapless groups took some time, even when done efficiently and on many swift horses. Eventually, the riders followed the trail of wounded men returning to the road, and located the place of the battle. Their arrows punctured the phalanxes to their rear, and made parts of them turn and face various directions, which was something that has unravelled this military method whenever it has been used, and hence rendered the phalanx unpopular in most places, since messy arrangements in massed battle are essentially an inevitability. This weakness can be overcome to some extent with the employment of first-rate equipment and training, and the Seleucids had this on their side here. The Anthropophagi depleted their arrows and went away to fetch more, distressed at having not scattered the enemy as they were planning, and the sandstorm delayed their return. Therefore, the battle was not won, and hours more fighting took place after the pikes were turned aside and a general melee was achieved. The Phalangites bore round shields and short swords that had no problem cutting through the leather and light panoply the citizen soldiers trusted in. This shocked the Bosporans, while the Seleucids were not obviously shocked even when completely surrounded, and made aware that their rearguard was in flight. The only way to smother their will to fight was to destroy their bodies. This was a quality they shared with the Bosporans, and it had the same cause. Both groups were picked out for their qualities as colonists and sent to do great things in dangerous places. Therefore, the fighting was exhausting and inhumane. Aeneas came to blows with many opponents in person, and he reported that 2 he slew immediately, 4 after exchanging 1 or 2 attacks, and the rest withdrew for respite before he or they was sufficiently wounded to claim a true victory. He praised the experience for its edifying qualities, and recommends it above sparring for making meaning of one's life, although I am not entirely sure what is meant by this, and most who go through these kinds of trials will recommend otherwise. This goes to show what the character of Aeneas was, and why he was able to win without possessing the talent of a leader who could share his heart with all men. After the battle, 4,000 bodies were counted on the field. 3 and 4 were of Hecatompilos. Not many troops had fled, so there was an unusual calm after the action, with little to be gained in further searching and exertion. After resting for 1 night, Aeneas took his men to the city and received gracious welcome from the leading citizens. He did not mock their meek and supplicant nature, and took himself in as the city's new governor, with well-received promises that he would keep all goings-on regulated as they had been before. This was not a promise he could keep, of course. Still, it is remarkable that there was no long siege or violent holdout action. I would judge that the nobles of the city held the health of their enterprises above those of the empire, and so there was little loyalty to the state among them. That is why one empire supplanted the other, like a night watchman relieving the man of the previous bell. Often it is said that Aeneas walked continually from the watchtowers of Sarai to the gates of Hecatompilos, but for a single morning on which he forgot to pick up his shield and was obliged to go and retrieve it. As untrue as this is, the impression it gives describes the Resolute Conquest well. After the city was quietly removed from the Seleucid roster, Aeneas organized the Hyrcanian fleets to his liking, and sent requests to his people in Sarai to ferry him future commands. The campaign had lasted only 2 months, and had achieved its objective well. Aeneas gathered large amounts of tribute that were supplied by nearby towns and villages seeking favour with the Bosporans, and he let it be left aside so that the Chariskos Council, having shown interest in the expedition, could decide what to do with it. When he did not hear back after several months, Aeneas chose to build a large library that the Scions of Gold might use to organize their canon there in the east. It is not what the Chariskos Council wanted, but as I have said, Aeneas was a leader who was improper but effective. Since the distances involved and narrow avenues of communication create a lethargy for a state wishing to coddle its governors with specific guidance, the best approach was to forgive insubordination when it was fortuitous and punish it when it was damaging. The Seleucids and their predecessors already knew this, and the machines of city life happily carried on. This takeover shocked Alector the Humble, the Seleucid king, who went from Antioch to convene at the Euphrates with his generals. Hearing that Hecatompilos had fallen without a siege, and that the Bactrians had been supplied experienced allies from the north, they were terrified that their state could be threatened by enemies they had considered timid. Notably, the record of these discussions implies that not all of the officers understood that the Ptolemies and Bosporans were in league, and were horridly surprised by the assessment of how much power was being tilted towards their court. To take control of the situation, they resolved to organize themselves against Aeneas and crush the dissent in the east as their first priority. That decision is why all I have said here is important. The Seleucid response to it forewent response to the far more serious threat that lay in the bloody ambition of Dion and the Ptolemies. Therefore, we shall later hear of more grand yet misguided battles in the east, while horrid and history-altering things were taking place in the west. With such a claim made, I must return us to the affairs of Dion, so that you can learn what I am referring to, and not believe I am exaggerating. In the summer of 170 prior, a patrol was dispatched from Hierosolima to investigate a rumour that the Seleucids were moving towards the city along the coast, and as always, Dion went out with the men in person. He discovered that this raiding party was in disarray and not properly armed or supplied. It was not an attack but a retreat. Dion took the men captive, gained from them what information he could, and then sent them to Hierosolima to be ransomed. I suspect they never were. From this he learned of a surprise attack on Antioch, the royal docklands at the Inner Sea's northeast corner, an attack which had been catastrophically successful. Calling for more horses and chariots to catch up with his party, Dion began the journey there at once. When he set eyes upon the city in the distance, it was obvious that the waters nearby were crowded with ships. They were low in the water with their loot, and the city smoked and echoed with the pains of loss. The banners raised on the masts and walls advertised the master of this scene, the Ptolemaic kingdom. As Dion and company neared the city, a delegation came out to welcome them. Some of this group were military officers in Hellenic attire, but more notable were the men in robes and tattoos who came most eagerly to the front of the pack. These were the Scions of Gold, whose banner was not planted upon the devastation, yet a truer banner it would have been there. Dion was greeted with royal deference, and all might have looked ordinary had so many of the welcoming party not been bloody with the signs of their work. Dion was quiet and withheld judgment, wishing to be taken to receive reports of all that was happening. Here is what he learned. The Ptolemies had taken his strategy from Tyre and employed it here, first engaging Antioch's huge army to the north with their expeditionary force from Asia, then striking into the city's waterfront with all the ships available. The Seleucid troops were not well led and could not manage this assault calmly. Victory was had in all quarters quickly, and a surrender was taken to prevent any desperate fighting or attempts to flee. On the latter point, the invaders were quick to secure and bar the city gates, wishing to have their prizes penned. I have mentioned before how Ptolemy XII was an unsound man whose interest in death magic was not especially pious. Still, his directive had been influenced by the foreign ideas of the Scions of Gold, and that entailed the lightening of death in his mind to a point when his reason could agree to his whim. That is why he ordered the people of Antioch to be massacred. The ships, now beginning to pass away from the city, were laden not with money but with the deceased, for they were to be a tool with which Prince Dion would supposedly bring an end to the rebellious history of the Judeans, and more broadly, bring order to the world in a way that would benefit the order makers most. That is what Ptolemy XII told his court. His court was not permitted to disagree with him, so there are no records of what they really thought, although the anecdotes I have heard from Alexandria suggest they were won over by the spiritual drunkenness that victory brings about. Similarly, if Dion was shocked or appalled by all this, then he did not allow it to be known. His entourage reported to scholars in later times that Dion's questions were primarily in regard to the fall of the city, of the military details involved. This was because he had made his own plans to take most cities in the region already, all but Antioch, which he had considered too strong to overcome. Ordinarily, he might have been correct, yet it seems that the particulars of circumstance let through a mighty shift in the fates, and there is much speculation to be had on the meaning of this. Those who share the view of the Scions of Gold will often refer to this event as one that demonstrates how the will of the tripartite works on a material level, and of the importance of deadly sacrifice, as opposed to the older and more careful views of the lawkeepers of the Lithosis, the cult of Gwenna as they were dubbed much later. Since this topic is too enormous and indeed too important to broach here, we should carry on, but at least now you know the place the Prize of Antioch has in the course of history. Prince Dion took his allotment from the prize and employed them for their intended purpose in Palestine. Over a month, pits were dug in all places not being used by farmers, which were many since farmers were few, and beside each pit was placed a beam of timber. The pits were so great in number that there was not enough timber available to purchase for this at any price, and so Dion seized most of the ships the Ptolemies had used to ferry the prize and had them broken apart to supply his magic. It is said that harrowing landscapes of these burial pits were to be found all around Hierosolyma, and on the coming of an auspicious day, they were to be transformed into orchards of life. The day was one on which the 5 planets would all be distant from the full moon, indicating that the power of Taurus was surging up, and the reach of the gods was diminished. Since the bodies to be supplied to the pits had been unburied in the meantime, the heat had twisted them and made them rancid. The process of carting a corpse to each pit was horrid, and required a great deal of punishment among the slaves to achieve. In particular, Dion came and selected one slave to be buried also, not only to set an example to the others, but to prime his magic with a spark of life. That is what the records say, and I do not know if Dion himself really thought this, since the story of this night was kept by priests and not scholars, the latter being unable to witness it in their right mind. After all the seeds were planted, so to speak, the pits were filled and marked with the prepared stretches of timber. In a single night, tens of thousands of these posts were erected below the full moon, so that it turned the arid wastes into a woodland, albeit of a dead and weathered appearance. The Scions of Gold went and burned a large amount of the deceased's possessions in a ceremony in the city, and they did not record the details of how they carried this out. That night it is well attested that the sky began to turn yellow, and this is not only above the ritual grounds, but in any place one cares to ask. Swirls of gold were seen all across the world, and there can be no doubt that the spirit of the tripartite was being renewed, no matter how improper or misguided you think the matter to be. The final part of the ritual came in the light of day, when the city folk were invited to a procession that toured the new orchards with the cauldrons of blood from Tyre following on wagons. The blood was mixed with water and used to moisten the dirt around the timber stakes. A rumour spread that any who partook in this would be blessed with the windfalls of Ymo's coming regeneration, and so soon even high-born men were using their cupped hands to cast blood upon the earth. The Scions of Gold did not instruct them to do this, nor did they disapprove. Upon returning to the city, Dion gathered the crowd and addressed them, saying, "You are made children of your lord always when you are knowing my kin," and other such confusing things. The message was that the domain of the Judean High Lord, that is, Ymo, should be considered to be expanded to the temporal domain of Dion's family, the Bosporan Empire. So then the Judeans were permitted to live anywhere in this vast territory, or so Dion encouraged them to believe. Since it was their own morality that policed the restriction, it was up to each individual to come to accept the result of the grand magics or not. Inevitably, there was a factionalism about this, which caused a schism among the believers and the skeptics. While that is not unusual, Dion had no plan to address its occurrence. He preferred to group all those not in alignment with his new rulings on religious matters to be equally criminal to those opposing him on political grounds. That is to say, he outlawed all talk that the ritual had not correctly achieved precisely what he had said, even though there was not much agreement on what he had said. This meant that while a certain faction of the Judeans came to have their loyalty to the Bosporans properly forged, another was made to reinforce the hinterland rebels, and thus a state of war across Judea remained. Dion was not perturbed by this, and carried on his military duties for the remainder of the year with his usual efficacy. One party that did not enjoy the exact result of the ritual was Ptolemy XII. Even though the young king received many bones for use in his private projects, he did not enjoy the idea that Dion had used the stunt to make the Judeans loyal to himself and not to the Ptolemaic Empire, which supposedly ruled Judea. There was little military or legal reality to this anymore. He sent several letters that demanded elements of the ritual be repeated, so that it would be accepted that Egypt and the domain of the Ptolemies was included in the set of places the Judean god resided. Dion did not respond, I am told, although others did respond with platitudes in his stead. The result was that nothing was done about the complaints, and Ptolemy XII was not one who would abide this. He already knew what he needed to do, and the Scions of Gold were all too happy to help him. Therefore, preparations for a new ritual began, and there were only two things which could stop another unguided mass killing being carried out. First was Seleucid King Elector, who had a large army at the Euphrates River waiting to be dispatched. Second was a more curious interloper on these events, Prince Dorius, whose expedition to join the Seleucid War had nearly arrived. In my next chapter, I will detail everything these two powers did, and you will see why it was the case that the killing and misuse of magic was far from over.